Good evening, everybody out there in Zoom land, and welcome to the Sage Wednesday Night Masterclass. We will get going in earnest in a couple of minutes. I'll give it just 2 or 3 minutes, well, maybe more than that, to make sure that everyone has figured out their Eventbrite to Zoom to linkage to camera to everything else. So while we wait, do familiarize yourself with the screen, just getting comfortable with where the Q&A section is and everything like that, just so you can ask any questions throughout. The session will last about 45-50 minutes, and I will be going through the fundamentals of coffee this evening. I'm using the Sage Barista Pro. If that's not the machine that you have at home, please don't worry. I will make allusions to all other machines when necessary. So that we're not just standing and I'm staring directly at a camera silently. I'm going to make a coffee quickly on this machine. You don't need to follow along, I promise. It's just to make sure that if any stragglers are trying to figure out their way through the internet, they can make it onto us for the content. This evening will be in 4 sections. So the first section will be all to do with our dialing in process. So that's broken down into our grind, our dose, and our tamp. Okay, these are the things that people ask the most about, that people find maybe the trickiest to kind of come to terms with. And so we will spend quite a lot of time on there because it's very, very important. It seems a little bit confusing to begin with, but I assure you, once you get comfortable with it, it really shouldn't give you any anxiety right there. So we'll grind, dose, and tamp and talk about flavor and how we change our grinder to get the best flavor, that kind of premium, ideal, and personalized touch on there. I'm just gonna move that plant ever so slightly. And then section 2 will be our extraction. What it should look like, what that tells us about the coffee, and how we can make adjustments to ensure that we are getting our perfect shot of espresso each and every time. That is actually pouring out rather nicely this evening. I am pouring the beautiful dark side of the Edge right there from Edge Coombs. Edge Coombs. Now that's pouring beautifully. And then we'll, in section 3, go over milk texturing. Now, I am doing some milk alternative here. We will talk about ordinary dairy milk as well, of course. The principles are the same. I'm just doing that because I might have a sip of this, and I don't drink dairy milk. But we'll talk about kind of placement of the steam wand, what best practices are to ensure that you are getting that microfoam, that fabulous, fabulous milk texture to enjoy any of your milk-based drinks. So if it's your cappuccinos, right down to your cortados, we will go over why you need to adjust for certain kinds of milks and what the best practices are. If anyone's joined the session while I've been making this coffee, please don't worry. It's not that you're late and have missed anything. I'm just making the coffee while we waited for you. But if you could, do familiarize yourself with the screen. It's Zoom, as we all know and love it. But we do have a Q&A section up there for you to ask any questions as well. And I'll let you know a little bit more about that momentarily. So once we've got that lovely texture in there, we'll then clean as we go this evening. I'll talk about cleaning throughout, just to make sure that you have a fabulous machine that loves you for a very, very long time. simple little things that we can put into our practice to make sure that the machine stays in top notch for years and years to come. Once we have our fabulous milk and we have our beautiful espresso, section 4 will be all to do with how we pair them all together, right? A little bit of latte art to practice. So I'll do just a little stack in there. There we go. It's nothing more difficult than that. Will I get it the right way around? That way around? No. Every time I do it the wrong way around. There we are. Just a little stack of tulip. Let me give that a taste. Oh, that's good. So, we'll do latte art right at the very end. If you can't do any latte art currently, you probably won't be able to do it by the end of the session, but I'll give you all of the tools to make sure that you can practice to get there, and it is just practice, I promise. Now, I am joined this evening by the fabulous Mr. Joel. Joel, are you there, and can you see and hear me okay?
I am. Whoa, I'm very loud. Yes, I am here. I can see you, and we are ready to go. We've got a good number of people popping up into the masterclass. We are ready to go, Luke.
Great, great. And go we shall, Joel. So, for everyone who wasn't here bang on 6 o'clock when we started, you're very welcome to Sage Wednesday Night Masterclass. My name is Luke Lane. I have been working with Sage for a little over 8 years, and I've been doing these classes for nearly 3 years, I think, virtually. And this evening's session is all about the fundamentals of coffee. How do you get that cafe quality coffee at home using your machine? It doesn't need to be the Sage Barista Pro. That's the one I'm using this evening. But I will talk about other machines when they differ in any way. So don't worry if you have an Oracle Touch or a Bambino or anything in between. I will make allusions throughout. Those dulcet tones you heard there, very loudly at the start, belong to Joel. Joel is moderating our call this evening. So if you have any questions, you can ask them throughout the session and Joel will be able to answer them by typing back to you. If he doesn't get back to you straight away, to make his evening much more enjoyable, we'll try to implement a couple of rules. One is that if he doesn't answer your question straight away, it's not that he's ignoring you, I promise. It may well be that he is saving the question until the end because it's going to be easier for me to answer or for me to show on camera. So I will check in before the end of the session and we'll do a little Q&A for any outstanding questions that are there. So don't feel that he's kind of skipped past your question and try not to ask that same question again and again because it just ruins the order of things if Joel has put it to the side. The other thing to note is that the session will be structured into 4 sections. So if you have a question about a specific section, do try to hold off until the end of that section to ask the question. I will let everyone know when a section has ended, just to make sure that we're not asking questions that are about to come up. And hopefully everything in this evening's session covers a great breadth of everything that you'll need to know for that fabulous coffee at home. But please do ask questions if there's anything in the presentation that you find slightly confusing or anything like that. It is a session to make sure that everyone is getting the best out of their machine. So don't be afraid to ask the question. Just pop it in that Q&A section and we will certainly do our best to help you this evening. Right, I think it's time to get going. Just to let everyone know, the 4 sections are dialing in, so everything to do with our grinder to begin with. Then we'll move on to our extraction, what we're looking for, what that tells us about the coffee. Then we'll texture our milk. We'll talk about the theory behind milk texturing, a little bit of chemistry, not too much, I promise you. I'll try not to bore you on this Wednesday evening. And then we'll look at latte art at the very end. Everyone wants to do it, and I'm going to give you all the tools to make sure that you can practice at home. Okay, section 1 are dialing in. Now, when it comes to dialing in, there's a few sort of myths or confusions out there. And what I like to do in these sessions is try to demystify as much as I can all of the information that people tend to trip up on or information that's out there on blogs and YouTube pages and stuff that is just slightly confusing. So when we look at dialing in, the reason we want to be able to change our grinder is because coffee is very, very different all around the world, okay? Where we get our beans from is going to be really important. It should be unsurprising that beans.com has a little box beside us. So if anyone's looking for beans and they want that high quality coffee, beans.com is a great one-stop shop. It's where you ought to go to have any of those questions answered and to access some of the best coffee in the country. It's all on there. It's about 19 to 20 different roasters, all independent. And from there, you're going to get fresh specialty coffee. When we talk about having that cafe quality coffee, the first thing that we need to be aware of is what we're putting into the machine. The machines are fabulous, but unfortunately they are not magic. So we need to make sure that we're just putting in high quality produce inside to get high quality results. So when we look at kind of sourcing our coffee, speciality, if it's labeled specialty coffee, it means it's been independently graded by an independent grader and it's achieved over 80%. Okay, so that's specialty coffee. Then it's looking at freshness. So coffee needs a little bit of time after it's been roasted, about 4 to 6 days after roasting, to kind of relax and calm down and let some of those gases off. And then it stays at its best for about 28 days. Sometimes people say 4 to 6 weeks as well. But that's kind of the life of that coffee being at its best. Okay, you're looking at about a month. Anything older than that, it's not that it's useless, it's not that it's harmless, it's just lost a lot of its potency and a lot of its flavor. So it's going to be very difficult to extract high quality espresso from older, drier coffee. We do have baskets, those dual-walled baskets that come with all of our machines are for your pre-ground coffee, but you can also use them if you have much older coffee, even if it's whole beans, just because they'll dry out. And we'll come on to this later on, but it's important to realize that what we put into the machine is going to make a huge difference, because all coffee needs different attention. And it needs different attention for a variety of different factors. So things like where it was grown, what kind of coffee it is, how it was grown, how it was picked, how it was processed, how it was dried, how it was roasted, how it was transported, how it was stored, how old it is. If it's a blend, if all of these different things go into why coffee is so vastly different. But the main thing we want to focus on, the thing that changes the flavor, once we've bought the coffee that has the tasting notes that we want, you know, if it's mandarin orange and, I don't know, paprika, something like that, licorice and lavender, right? We'll find that from the bag. We want to make sure it's high quality and that it's fresh. But once we get it at home, we want to manipulate our grinder to bring out the flavors that we personally like the most. And so the best way to think about this is we have our portafilter here, our portable filter or handle. And in here, we grind our coffee. We compress it down with a tamp just to make sure that the water doesn't move the coffee out of the way. And then the water passes through the coffee and under pressure takes some of the flavors from the ground coffee and passes that through this basket in here. And that's what ends up with our hot water into our espresso cup. Okay? Now, the chief way that we affect the flavor of the coffee will be the amount of resistance that water meets inside this basket. Okay? So it's about how much resistance is in this basket for that water to get through and into our cup. That's going to dictate the flavor. Now, that's where our 3 subsections come in, because that resistance is going to be dictated by how much coffee we have actually in the basket, so our dose, how much coffee. It's going to deal with our tamp, okay, have we compressed it sufficiently? And then the one that we focus on the most is our grind size. How big are those pieces of coffee inside our basket? All of that will affect the resistance. Now, of those 3, the one that we want to give most of our attention to, the one that we want to manipulate the most, or most readily, is the grind size. Okay, so the grind size is here on the side. With grind size, rather than just thinking about coffee as its own little thing, an analogy tends to be really handy for everyone. So, our analogy is, instead of coffee, we just have 2 buckets. It's getting warm now, so we can think of the seaside. We have 2 buckets with perforations at the bottom, with holes at the bottom. In bucket A, it's filled with pebbles. Pebbles in bucket A. Bucket B, it's filled with sand. Okay? Now we take 2 cups of water and we dump them over the top of each bucket. Now with the bucket full of pebbles, we'll notice that water starts pouring out of the bottom really easily, because it's just finding all of those big gaps between those pebbles and rushing out of the bottom. With a bucket of sand, our water soaks into the sand and very slowly makes its way through. We're waiting an inordinate amount of time for any water to seep out of the bottom. that idea, if you have that in your head, that's exactly what happens when we adjust our grinder. We're changing it from those pieces being coarse, quite big, pebbledy pieces, or more of our sand to soak in. And that's going to be the main way that we want to change the resistance inside that basket. Is it too much like pebbles? Is it too much like sand? Okay, once we have that in our head, that's how we can start really elevating the quality of the coffee that's coming out of our machine. So having nice flexibility in your grinder is going to be really important here, which is why from the Barista Express, we start with 16 different grind sizes. So you want to be able to manipulate that as much as possible so that you're bringing out the flavors you most enjoy. Now, when we talk about what it is that we're aiming for, there's a few things that will tell us if we have too coarse or too fine a grind size. Okay? So, if our grinder is set too coarse, we'll notice 4 or 5 things happening when we pour ourselves an espresso. It depends on the machine itself, so I'll go over this. The first is that the liquid flowing out of the machine looks very light, very pale, and very watery. Okay, it doesn't have a lot of body to it. It doesn't seem very kind of substantial as it's pouring out. It will be pouring out very, very quickly. So there's not much resistance in there, so the water is almost free flowing out of the machine. You might even see it splashing around, or it ribboning, or yeah, just splashing left and right, very uneven streams coming out. In terms of the crema on top, so the crema is just that froth on the top of a shot of espresso if you look at it in the glass. So that crema will be very thin, very pale, very light. The time it takes, right? So, sorry, that's in terms of speed. It'll be very, very quickly. And then we're looking at when we taste our coffee, okay? The taste is going to be really important. How does it feel in the mouth? Is it very thin or is it very sort of stodgy? It will be quite thin and it will taste a little bit wishy-washy and it will taste very sour, okay? So the reason it tastes sour is that the easiest flavor to get out of these beans is the sourness. So when we don't have a very long contact time between our water and our coffee inside this basket, the water only has the opportunity to take out the sourness from the coffee, and it's leaving behind all that lovely sweetness and saltiness and bitterness that we want from our coffee, and it's going to be unbalanced. So it tends to taste quite sharp, okay? And that's because they're the flavors that jump into the water most readily. So when we get that, we can tell that there's likely to be not enough resistance inside that basket. The fifth kind of telltale sign is if we have a machine like the Barista Express or the Barista Express Impress or the Joule Boiler, they have a dial on the front, and that is looking at how much force the machine is using to get the water through the coffee. So if that needle doesn't move very much, it means that the machine doesn't have to use a lot of force to get the water through the coffee. And again, it's a real telltale sign that there's too much space in there, it's too much like the bucket of pebbles, and that water's flowing through too easily. So all of those 5 things are indicative of under-extracted coffee. Quite literally, we haven't extracted all the flavors we want from our ground coffee into our cup. And the main way that we want to adjust for this is we want to change the grind size and make it finer. On all of our machines, the lower the number, the finer the grind size. So we want to lower that number to get a better extraction from that under-extracted coffee. Now, on the flip side, if it's too finely ground, well, the opposite of those 5 or 4 things are true. So the liquid flowing out is very dark, very sort of thick, almost treacly as it's pouring through. It's pouring extremely slowly, drip by drip by drip, just like that sand. The crema, that froth on the top, is either non-existent or just sort of patchy, little islands on the top of the shot. And that's because the crema only exists by way of the gas escaping from the liquid, okay? So when that liquid is so thick, so dense, the bubbles can't come through. So that's why they only come out in part, but otherwise everything's trapped inside there. The pressure gauge, if we have one, that will be waning up towards the top as the machine is really trying its hardest to get the water through that coffee. And then the fifth, final, and most important aspect, the flavour, the taste, that will taste, again unbalanced, and bitter. Okay? I'll come back to flavour in a moment because there's another confusion there, but it will taste bitter. And the reason it tastes bitter is because we have that long contact time where the water is in with the coffee for too long. It's taking too many of the flavours. Now, as I said before, the easiest flavour to take out is the sourness, but the most plentiful flavour, most of the flavours within roasted coffee are bitter. So when that water is in with that coffee for too long, it still takes out the sourness and puts it into our cup, and we have some sweetness and we have some saltiness, we have all the other flavours that we want, but they're all crowded out by the amount of bitterness that we're getting into the cup. And that's the big telltale sign. If our grind is too fine, it's slow, it's quite thick liquid, the pressure gauge is really up at the top, the crema is very thin or patchy, or maybe even non-existent, and it tastes bitter. That is over-extracted coffee. And the main way of adjusting for that is to make your grind coarser. So these are the things, it's sourness and bitterness that we're really focusing on. But here's a very unfortunate thing, particularly for me in my line of work, is that for native English speakers, we find it incredibly difficult to discern two flavours, and you'll never guess which ones they are. Yeah, it's sourness and bitterness. So I don't know why we're not particularly good at this. In other languages, apparently they are much better, but we're not. So I have another analogy for you this evening. If we think of a lemon, right? Sourness is biting into the flesh of a lemon. Okay, so it's that very sharp, very acidic taste. We tend to narrow our eyes and scrunch our face, and we tend to salivate along the sides of our tongues. That's sourness. Okay? So if you're tasting and you're going, that coffee doesn't taste quite right, think, is that more of biting into the flesh of a lemon? Now, bitterness, we can still use a lemon for bitterness. So the white on the skin of a lemon is bitter, but much more potent than that, paracetamol. Okay, so uncoated paracetamol or chewing on paracetamol, that's almost pure bitterness. So it's that very drying taste, quite cloying, and it dries out the back of your mouth, right? That chalky taste, that's bitterness. And so when we're tasting our coffee, if it doesn't taste right, remember it's on a spectrum. So I can't say to you that you must extract your coffee a certain way, because you and I might have different taste buds and different preferences than each other, than Joel, but it's about knowing when you make your adjustment, if you're making it finer or coarser, you're bringing it towards more bitterness or towards more sourness, or you're balancing these things off. Because there are no right or wrongs in coffee. It's about ensuring that you are getting exactly the kind of drink that you most enjoy. That's why we have favorite cafes to go to, because the barista's there, pick coffee and dial it in the way we tend to like it. And when you have one of these machines at home, there's no reason why you can't be getting that fabulous, fabulous espresso each and every time. Just adjusting that grinder when necessary. Now, as I say, it's not just the grind size, we also have the dose and the tamp. So let's go over those. The main thing to remember, from here on in, it's about consistency. The machine will do the same thing every time as we've set it, so then we as the barista also need to do the same thing. I'm just attaching a little dosing funnel here, just in case anyone is confused. They're not by any means an absolute necessity, but I am doing this all backwards, so they are quite helpful to avoid mess. And I'm clicking into grind. Now, this machine is grinding out my beans, and if I didn't have the dosing funnel, I would probably just be bouncing that handle a little bit to even out everything, because I don't want this big mound and I don't want any spilling. Okay? So I'll take this out, and then in here, I'm just going to tap it on the table to ensure that I have a relatively even puck. Now, if we look on here, we can see that it's a bit like this. Yeah? So it's all kind of crowded onto this side. Now, ideally, what I want is for it to be more even than that. Because if I was to tamp this straight down, I'm going to have more coffee on this side than this side. And so all of the water is going to try to go through the side of least resistance. And that way, even if I have a perfect grind size, I'll end up with an odd extraction because the water's not going through all of the coffee. Very easy to fix. We don't need any fancy tools or anything. We're just going to tap it on the side, and then we can always do our little chops. Just remember, wherever you're hitting, the coffee comes towards you. So if I'm hitting at the back here, the coffee's going this way. If I hit here, it's going that way. So now that we have that much more even, I'll take out my tamp. When it comes to tamping, people ask about tamping all the time, and the truth is, there's not much to it. We just want to make sure that it is flat, compact, and even. That's what we're going for, okay? So you don't need to get out any kind of scales or anything like that. Ideally, you just want to do the same thing every time. Flat, compact, and even. Now, to keep it as even as possible, use all of your body weight. Just get a right angle on your elbow and fully lean against the portafilter, okay? Ensuring that this isn't off to any odd angle, we can just keep our fingers on the outside and make sure that that's all even. Now we have a lovely flat puck there. And then my favorite tool, which I know lots of people go, I didn't get one of these. You did, and it was in a lovely felt box as well. But people tend to not use these, which is a real shame because we put them in for a reason. This is the razor tool, and this is going to make sure that you have the right amount of coffee and that it's all even. So all we do is we pop it on the top and we spin it around, and any excess coffee that we have there, so little bits of excess coffee there, will rise up, and we can just ensure that they fall straight off. So over a knockbox is always helpful. Any excess coffee, you don't have very much there. So then, as I've disrupted that, I'm just going to very lightly place this back on top to make sure I don't have any grinds standing on the top. From here, we have a perfectly prepped puck right there. Just exactly what we want. We know we have the same amount of coffee. We've tamped the same. And therefore, as I lock this in place, if it doesn't pour perfectly, I just need to adjust my grind size. And that will make the big difference. So it's about keeping everything else the same so that I'm allowed to change my grind size and I know there's a direct relationship. Now I see people doing all of this lovely work, and then when they go to put their portafilter inside their machine, they just clatter it all around, ruining all the work that they did. So just spending a little bit of time getting comfortable, getting that in the right place. Cup underneath. That's section 1 sorted, so any questions about section 1, please do ask as we move on to our extraction. I press my double shot, because we have a double shot basket there, and that's what we're pouring. And then my counter starts. Okay, so we have a 7 to 10 second pre-infusion in the machines, where nothing really happens. We can hear the machine running, but then it kicks into high gear after that. And then as we look at this, it's pouring out. Okay, a little bit splashy, but not altogether that bad. Getting quite light now. Okay, and that's finished at 22 seconds, right? So, as I look at this shot, now, here's a really good tip. If you want really nice coffee, and you buy very nice coffee, it tends to look pretty good no matter what we do. So this doesn't look bad at all, to be honest. This shot looks quite appetizing, really. It's sort of clinging to the sides of the cup as I spin it around. That's a good sign. It is quite pale as I look in at it. It doesn't have very much ombre, not very interesting looking, but certainly not bad. Let me give it a smell. Okay, no harsh notes in there. I'm going to give this a little taste. Okay, it's not bad. It's not the best, but it's not bad. What this really is lacking is, I'm trying to find a better term. I can't. It's lacking any kind of interesting tastes to it, to be honest. It's quite thin, despite quite a nice crema on the top. It still is quite thin in the mouth, and it really just doesn't have very many different flavors going on. It's not the worst coffee I've ever had by a long way, but also it doesn't have the depth of flavor that I want that makes me go, oh, that's a lovely cup of coffee. It doesn't have that element to it at all. And it is just a little bit sharp in the first instance. Your first kind of taste of it is a bit, ooh, okay. And that is my first big telltale sign. If the first time you drink the espresso, you immediately go, ooh, it's likely to be exactly what all the other things are pointing to in this coffee. That is slightly under-extracted. It's not to say that someone may drink this and go, that is the nicest coffee I've ever had in my whole life. Absolutely fantastic. Then you don't need to change anything. But for myself, that is under-extracted coffee. Not to any horrible degree. And remember, if we're making it into a latte or if we're making it into Americano or anything like that and diluting it in any way, then that will change the game as well because we're bringing in other flavors. But for this, it just doesn't have that quality that I want. So I will be making my adjustment because this particular coffee was tasting its best closer to 30 seconds is how long it took when it was really tasting its absolute best. And so this was 22 seconds all in all. Just quite quick, really. So I need to adjust to slow down that pour to bring out more flavors, more kind of deliciousness from it. So we're going to do just that. Now, I take out and I knock out my puck. Always, always, always have a microfiber cloth. Could just be a regular cloth. But we want one half of it to be nice and dry because this is a big thing. When we're making coffee, we always want to work with a clean, dry, warm portafilter. Clean, fairly obvious. We don't want any old coffee in there. Dry, because if it was wet, then when the coffee grinds into it, it just cakes in different ways and we get inconsistencies. And then the one that people don't really think about is we want this to be warm every time. Because this is all stainless steel, as is our group head. So the liquid will just pour differently if it's hot or if it's cold. In truth, we could dial in for a cold machine in the cold portafilter and get great results. Might be slightly cold results, but great results. The issue would be that then we'd need to cool down the machine every time we tried to use it again. It's just not very practical. So when you're first using the machine, lock the portafilter in place, pour a blank shot through the machine to make sure there's no air pockets and warm everything up. And that, give it a nice dry, make sure it's all clean, and then start going. That way you avoid a fairly common thing that people ask about, which is if you make 2 coffees in the morning back to back, people say, I make 2 coffees and I'm getting different results. Usually, 99% of the time, it's just because the first one that they made was with a cold portafilter, the second time it had been warmed up. So you're getting different results. So just do a little pre-warm and that will really save you any kind of worry right there. Okay, now, I'm going to pop that back in and I'm going to, because my coffee was pouring too quickly, it was under-extracted, I'm going to reduce my grind size, make it finer, okay? Now, we'll just reduce it a couple of notches down and I'm going to hold in my portafilter for a second. So I'm going to hold it in, and then after about a second and a half, I'm going to take that out, and this beautiful Edgecombe coffee that I just love goes straight in the bin, okay? Now I know I can hear you across the land screaming at your tablets, how could you, Luke? That coffee was beautiful. The reason is because some of the coffee in the machine, as it was grinding the last time I made a shot, hadn't come the whole way through when it stopped grinding. So what that means is that we have some retention in all grinders. The grinders in here are stainless steel conical burr grinders. They actually have very low retention, but they do have some retention. So in order to get it as accurate as possible, as quickly as possible, I just need to purge off a couple of grams of coffee, because otherwise this next shot would be a mixture of the previous grind size and the new grind size. In which case, even if it poured beautifully, I wouldn't know and I wouldn't be able to recreate exactly that because it would be a mixture. So I want to just purge that little bit to give myself more consistent results. So I'll lock that in place, let it grind, and let it grind out. Now, when you're looking at a grind out, as I say, I have a dosing funnel on there. So if you don't have that, you can always stop it maybe halfway and even everything out. But we just want to avoid any mess, really. Take that out, and then again, I'm just going to knock it down to the countertop. I don't actually have any distribution issues right there. So I'll take this off. And again, all of this, the very same. But here's an aspect. Because I've reduced that grind size by about 3 steps, I need to check again with my razor tool. And sure enough, I'm quite below where the razor line is. Meaning, I need to top up more coffee into the basket. So I'll just hold it in and grind for about, I'd say another 1.5 seconds should do that. Let me even it out again and give it a tamp. Lovely. Again, the tamp is just about being consistent. And then check with my razor. Might need just a hair more coffee in there. There we go, just a tiny bit more. So probably a full 1.5 seconds on there. Give that a good tamp. Razor off any excess. A little bit of excess, lovely. So I'll just readjust my grinder to 12 seconds from 10.5. That should do it for me. Beautiful. Now, everything else, very same. That perfectly prepped puck is back. And we lock this in place. Cup underneath, double shot. Now, when we're making our coffee, one of the things that people do bring up quite often is, what does it mean if my coffee starts pouring out of the machine after, say, 3 seconds? Oh, that's pouring much nicer now. Lovely drips. So what that means is, if it's pouring out very, very, very early, is either that you don't have enough coffee inside the basket, or it could be, and more likely, is that your coffee is slightly too old. Okay? When coffee gets older, it becomes porous, and at that stage, it means that you're getting much over extract. 32 seconds. This is going to taste fantastic. Okay, let me finish off this point. So if your coffee gets too old, it dries out, and so the water doesn't stay in it. It just rips through it. And so you can reduce your grind size as much as possible, but really, you either need fresher coffee or our pressurized baskets. Switch those in, and then even with ground beans that you're grinding, if they're slightly too old, those pressurized baskets will really help give you a more balanced flavor from older, drier coffee, as well as pre-ground. Now, let's have a look at this. Yes. Okay. Now, as we look at this is really sticking to the sides, and there's loads of different colors in there as well. It's a much deeper color, and it's kind of sticking to the sides. Even from the table, I can smell many different flavors, real deliciousness, kind of caramel, a slight nuttiness. Let me give it a smell properly. Yeah, that has that kind of aspect to it. Let me taste it. Oh yeah. Now that will keep you coming back for more. That is gorgeous coffee. Yeah, very nice. Actually, that was nicer than the one I poured before the class started. It's lovely. So it has that kind of balance to it. Nothing is overly powerful. It just has a real mellowness to it. Real body, real depth of flavor. I'm still getting lots of different flavors afterwards as well. What was happening with that first shot was as soon as I tasted it, I had that slight sharpness. Then almost no flavor was left. It was kind of just a whoop and then nothing. Whereas this has a beautiful sweetness to it that's kind of just lingering around with a kind of a longer aftertaste. Glorious. Now, if we look at these two coffees, they are the same in almost every way. It's the same machine, it's the same beans, it's the same amount, same barista, same water, same cups basically. But say you weren't as maybe into coffee or au fait with coffee as I am, anyone would be able to tell that there's a huge difference in flavor between these two different drinks. And I'm not saying that everyone, 100% of people, would prefer this one, the one I like more. And maybe that you like the first one more. And that's absolutely fine, because it's your house, they're your rules, you can do whatever you want. It's just about knowing that when you want to make an adjustment, you know which way you're going to adjust. Do you want to lean into version A or version B, or maybe you want to take it even further and have an even slower extraction and extract more, instead of more of the bitterness, really. But that's the kind of small changes that we need to make. It was 3 grind sizes was the difference between cup A and cup B. Flavor is completely different. And so do play around with it. If you're not getting that beautiful customized cafe quality coffee at home, have a quick play with your grinder, making sure your tamp is even and the same, and using that razor tool. And that will give you the kind of comfort and confidence to bring out the flavors that you really want to with your coffee. Now, anything to do with coffee, pop them in that Q&A section as I move on to milk. Now, when it comes to milk, it's just a little bit of chemistry to think about what we're actually doing when we texture milk. Now, I'm in the fabulous Sage Studios here in London, and we have lovely cameras and everything and lights and all sorts, but I still can't get a camera right in with a steam wand. So for the next section, this lovely brush will be my steam wand, because it's all about where you place your steam wand when you're manually texturing milk. So when it comes to milk, we're using what's already naturally prevalent in the milk to get that texture in that beautiful microfoam, where the bubbles are so small that we can't really discern them. It just looks shiny. Now that will have loads of benefits in terms of kind of bulking out the drink, allowing you to aspirate, to taste more of the coffee. It will sweeten the milk naturally, and it gives a lovely mouth feel. But in order to do that, we're using the protein, the carbohydrates, and the fat inside the milk, okay? We're agitating these to get these bubbles so small and uniform inside so that it has all of those benefits. Now, in order to do it, your steam wand and the spout of your jug are best friends, so you want to keep them together all the time. This is just really helpful to make sure that you don't move around too much. If you free float inside, you'll just move around way too much and you'll get lots of big bubbles in there. So lock them in place and have that spout just in with the steam wand. Then if we just go on that close camera there, so as we look, no, there we go. So as we look in here, we have those together, and then our steam wand is just skimming the surface of our milk, okay? And then off to either the left or the right. It doesn't really matter, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, just making sure that we create this whirlpool inside so that we're evenly heating and evenly texturing that milk. When it comes to how deep you want to put the steam wand, it's about listening to the milk. If you're in too far, you'll get this screeching sound, a very high-pitched, very unpleasant sound, and that will mean that you're essentially drowning the steam wand. You're not allowing any air to get into the milk. So it's really just about 1 centimeter inside the milk and off to an angle to ensure that you're creating that whirlpool. It should sound quite pleasant on the ear, really, like tearing a newspaper, really slowly tearing a newspaper. That's the kind of sound we're looking for. If, however, you're getting a very guttural sound, a very gurgly sound, that's probably that you're not inside the milk at all. So you're just firing the steam towards the milk. And again, you won't get great results then. So leaving it in there, spinning around nicely. And now it's about feeling the texture, feeling the temperature of that milk. So if it's cow's milk, if we get it too hot, it will start breaking down the structures that we need, that protein, that fat, okay? And it'll start cooking off the carbohydrates, taking away all the taste. So your cow's milk starts to split, starts to cook over 65 degrees. So once we get up 60, 65 degrees, if we let it get any hotter than that, we start splitting that milk and we won't be able to get brilliant results. As I said before, it's your house, they're your rules, you can do whatever you want. But one of the things is that you can't have beautifully textured milk if it's overly hot. So that's why if you go into a cafe and you order an extra hot cappuccino, you see the barista's face just fall. Because you can't really do that, get it too hot without compromising on the structure. So 60 to 65 degrees for our cow's milk. Now, when it comes to milk alternative, almost everything, it doesn't need to be this brand, by the way, they're not a paid sponsor, but I was drinking it earlier. But if we're using any milk alternative, now this goes for oat and almond and soy and pea milk and macadamia milk and all the rest of it, they have slightly different structures inside. The theory, the placement of the steam wand is the very same. Skimming the surface off to one side or the other, and we're listening out for the same noise. But we don't want them to get as hot. That's the big one, okay? So if we get these milks as hot, because they have a different structural makeup, they'll split at a lower temperature and they'll start to curdle. Particularly then when they're mixed in with the milk, mixed in with the espresso, it just will create a very unpleasant texture. So for our milk alternative, 55 degrees. Dairy milk, 65. Milk alternative, 55. Everything else we keep the very same. Now when we're sourcing our milk alternative, again it doesn't need to be these guys, but we just want to ensure that we are going for the barista edition or the professional edition if it's Alpro, or things along that line, because they'll have an emulsifier inside to give you slightly better results and keep it more stable when it mixes with the espresso. That tends to be the thing that trips people up. First and foremost, don't get them too hot, because they will split. Okay, now let's texture up some milk. We have our lovely cold milk into our lovely clean jug. We turn on our steam wand first, okay? So we want to make sure that there's powerful steam coming out of the steam wand before we start texturing it. That is very quick on this machine. It has a thermojet heating system, 3 seconds. So I'm going to pop it back to standby, and I'm going to get this into the correct angle. And so, I know Zoom takes out some of the noise, but hopefully we can kind of hear that. So very pleasant on the ear, quite quiet. That tearing sound there. And you can see that milk just spinning around. Lovely little vortex inside there. Now, this hand here is measuring the temperature. And fortunately, when it's uncomfortable against my hand, that's 55 degrees. As it's dairy milk, I'm in no great rush because it can take 60 to 65 degrees. For a milk alternative, as soon as it's uncomfortable against the hand, switch it off immediately. And then I have my lovely wet half of my microfiber cloth, and I am wiping down immediately. What was that? That was immediately my steam wand, because it's one of my pet peeves. Wipe it down to make sure there's no milk left on any side of it, and then turn the steam wand back on to make sure no milk is around the little holes in that steam wand. That little action will save you from having a bunged up steam wand for a very long time. As we look at this milk, it looks kind of nice and cloudy to begin with, but I want to do this small movement, okay? And all of a sudden, I start seeing the milk get very, very shiny. And what I'm doing by this little action, I'm going to hold it up here. What I'm doing by this little action is I'm mixing the froth, which is coming up at the top, with the denser milk, which is sinking to the bottom. And that's my first key aspect to latte art. I want to make sure these are all mixed together, because if I don't, I'll find it very difficult to draw anything. Now, as we move on to section 4, latte art is not rocket science, it's just practice, okay? But there's a few bits to keep in mind. This is key. Keep it active, because we don't want that froth to rise and that denser milk to sink. Now, I'm going to tell you the 3 steps that we're working on. Then I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to go into more detail, okay? So, if we pour from a height, then the milk is going to mix in with the espresso to create our canvas. Once it's 2/3 full, I'm going to pour low and fast, to get the white to form on the top. Then at the very end, I'm going to come back up and cut through my blob to form a heart. Let's show it right now. Pour from a height. Create my canvas. When it's 2/3 full, I'm going to pour low and fast. Up and through. For my heart shape. Which way is it? That way. No, every time. Point towards me. There we go, a lovely little heart in the middle. So, as we're looking at that, as opposed to, this is kind of bubbled out. can see that. It's the same idea, just more hearts in there. Now, when we go through and we think about what's actually happening there, it is really just that same separation thing that we were talking about to begin with. It's why we're mixing it all in. Because when we start to pour, we want that milk to fall in to create a nice base for us to pour our kind of picture, our design in. But if we pour too slowly, what happens is that froth rises to the top and ends up, as we tip our pitcher, the froth ends up back here. And the denser milk comes down into our drink. So at the very end, it just all falls in on the top like a big cloud. It's not great. So mix that all in, pour from our height to create our little canvas. And then the key thing, the thing that people feel very uncomfortable doing, but is necessary, is pouring low and fast. So remember, it's not just this way and that way. You can also just tip the jug more to allow that froth to draw on the top. As long as we're pouring into a circular receptacle, circular cup, then the shape that we'll form if we pour low and fast is a circle. At the very end, we then just want to come away and cut through. That will mean that it changes from a circle into that, face me, heart shape. Okay, so because it's coming straight through here. Now, the biggest thing to remember is that latte art only exists as a way for baristas to flirt with their customers. There's nothing more complicated than that. So it's not as tricky a thing to do. But main thing, mix together, pour from a height, low and fast, up and through. But remember, we're always going in the same direction, fundamentally. We're going in, down, up, through. So we're going across our body. Don't try to move around way too much, because that's going to trick everyone. And the other thing, from here, there's only really 3 things we can do with latte art. We can do just that standard heart, up, down, up and through. We can do what I did at the start, which was that stack, which is pouring from a height, then pouring low and fast, pouring a blob, stopping, pour another blob, stop, pour another blob, come up and cut through. That's giving us our kind of stacked tulip look. It's also how you do your rows, just different placement. The other thing that we can do is pour from a height, then pour low and fast and wiggle it sort of forward and back, right? That small movement. That will allow that brown to mix in with the white, and that's how we get our wiggle hearts, it's how we get our rosettas, it's how we get the wings of our swan, if we're feeling particularly fruity. But all of those things are just placement. So it's practice. I would highly recommend just focus. Everyone loves getting a nice heart on the top of their cup. So focus on getting that heart, getting it nice, big, symmetrical, right in the middle, and then move on from there. If you want to see massive improvements in your latte art, get lots of beans in, get lots of milk in, invite people over on the weekend, and make lots of coffees. Because when you go into a cafe and the barista is pouring beautiful latte art, remember, they've poured hundreds of coffees that day. And you might only be doing it twice a day, say 10 times a week. If you want to see an improvement, you just put it. It is very simple, but you just have to put them into practice, get the cups in, and you'll see a huge improvement very, very quickly. But remember, as great and as fun as latte art is, and I want you to all enjoy it, because if you have one of these machines, there's no reason why you can't. But the more important things are sections 1, 2, and 3. Only then, when we have those nailed, can we play around with our latte art. But equally, even if you can't get a beautiful picture on the top, if section 1, 2, and 3 are done, coffee will taste fantastic. So there we go. There's our fundamentals of coffee, all sorted on this Wednesday evening. Now, Mr. Joel, are you still there? You haven't fallen asleep on us or died of hay fever back there?
Not at all. I've been riveted. I've been learning things myself, Luke. So, we do have a couple of questions, and they're good ones. And let me just see if I can find it. So, this is a bit of a classic. How do you determine the correct amount, the correct number of seconds for the grind?
Correct number of seconds. So, your seconds will relate back to your razor, okay? So, always just rely on this razor tool, okay? Reduce it if you need to. If you're scraping off lots of coffee every time, might be a little bit less. If you need more, a second, half a second more. The thing to remember is that it's not just the seconds, right? So if the pieces of coffee, if your grind is much coarser, then over less time you'll get the same amount of coffee inside. So if you're making big changes to your grind size, always check with your razor and rely on the razor to whether you need more or less coffee in there, and then change the amount. Okay, so don't change them both at the same time. Rely on your grind size, use your razor, everything good, fantastic. Then, if you need to adjust your grind size, check with the razor. If you're razoring off a lot of coffee just because you've made it a lot coarser, then feel free to reduce the grind size so that you don't need to razor off any more coffee. But there isn't, I think what people often want is how far away is the razor. If it's a millimeter, does that mean half a second? And unfortunately there isn't a direct relationship there, but that tool is invaluable. It makes things really, really easy for us just to adjust when necessary.
Thank you very much, Luke. And another question is it normal that the coffee first comes out watery and then later creamy? So there's a sort of change in the consistency of the espresso as it's pouring?
Yeah, so that's absolutely what we expect, okay? So there's different sort of stages to our pour, if that makes sense. We won't get into too much detail because you can get a little bit lost in this. But it should start off usually in a thinner sense, darker, starting off in a kind of dark brown colour, and then by the end of your shot it's kind of more of a sort of honey colour, maybe even blonder than that, depending on the coffee that you're having and then depending on the ultimate result that you want. So if it's starting off dark and thin strips and ending up quite bulky, slightly lighter strips, that's absolutely fine, because if we think about this, in the same way that we were talking about it's to do with what flavors we're taking from the coffee, our initial sort of pour through our espresso, there'll be more oils at play. And as we strip those oils away, we are going to get different consistency coming out. For anyone who wants to look into that any further, that would dictate the difference between your ristretto, your espresso, and your lungo, which are all different forms of short coffee drinks. Just the same amount of ground coffee with different amounts of liquid poured through, but you'll see different consistencies in each of those because you stop pouring at different points.
Great. And last question is from Richard. Should we worry about getting a 2-to-1 extraction rate?
You should not. I know, quite frankly, no. But I understand exactly, Richard, where you're coming from. And that is someone who has obviously been reading some coffee blogs or talking to some baristas. Absolutely fair enough. 2-to-1 ratios tends to be, for, if anyone's out there going, what are you talking about? 2-to-1 ratio simply would mean that as a kind of rule of thumb, when you work in cafes, your input versus your output, you do 2-to-1. So that your coffee that you put into the basket, the ground coffee, weighs half the amount of the liquid espresso that you pour out. So 2 parts espresso from 1 part dry coffee. That, again, it's just a recipe. You don't need to go into that much detail, and most cafes won't just simply have it. You can have a 1 to 1.75, a 1 to 3 ratio. It's endless what you can be pouring. The main thing, if you're asking the question usually, just rely on tasting it. Do you like the taste of that coffee? Right? This machine normally works more towards, what we poured there is probably closer to a 1 to 2.5, maybe even 1 to 3 ratio. And as you may have noticed, I quite enjoyed that coffee. But before we get to that level of scrutiny and that level of detail, use your razor. That's going to give you 18 to 19 grams of coffee. And you're going to be pouring out around 50 to 55 mils of liquid espresso on a standard volumetric machine. Okay? But taste the coffee, use the grind size to manipulate that flavor. at that point, once you're super comfortable using it and using your razors and everything like that, in order to get your 1:2 ratios or to be playing around with ratios at that level, you'd need some very good digital scales. Now, it's a big thing that people buy a machine and then buy loads of kit to go with it, right? They spend another few £100 buying accoutrement without ever unboxing and using the machine. Once you're super comfortable using the machine as it comes, only then should you really need to or want to go more into it. But first get really comfortable with this, and then if you want to get out your scales, everything like that, absolutely. But my rule of thumb always is you should never spend more time making coffee than you do drinking coffee unless you're being paid. So there you go.
Marvellous, marvellous. Oopsie daisy, marvellous. Thank you ever so much, Luke. I think we're going to call it a night there as it's 7 p.m. So thank you ever so much for everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. If you have any further questions, jump on sageappliances.co.uk, and every 7 days a week from about 10 o'clock in the morning till 5:30, you can ask any of our experts here at Sage Studios live. Just click on that Ask an Expert and we'll be able to answer any further questions. But for this evening, for myself and Joel, thank you very, very much. Take care.